Amara woke up that morning with a special feeling of lightness, as if the universe was in perfect harmony around her. 10 years had passed since the day she said "I do" to Marcos, and looking back, she felt that their marriage had been the most beautiful journey of her life. She remembered the challenges, the victories, the little joys they shared every day, and she knew it was time to celebrate that date with something truly meaningful. Marcos had always been attentive and loving, and now Amara wanted to reciprocate in a special way. After thinking for weeks about the perfect gift, she finally decided she would go to the jewelry store to choose a unique piece that would symbolize 10 years of love and complicity. Amara has always valued symbolic gifts that carry stories and deep feelings. A delicate and eternal piece of jewelry seemed like the ideal choice. Still, without telling Marcos, she prepared herself carefully that morning. She chose an elegant but simple dress without many pretensions. She knew that at the jewelry store, it would be more about the meaning of the piece than about how she would be dressed. She looked at herself in the mirror, carefully adjusting her hair, and smiled. There was something serene in her face, a quiet confidence that reflected the achievements and successful life she had built with her husband. Amara was a CFO at a large company and was proud of the path she had taken to get there. It wasn't easy. As a Black woman, she had to overcome countless obstacles, prove her competence countless times, and fight against prejudice. But she always held her head high, certain that her worth was not in the opinions of others, but in what she knew she was capable of achieving. Her success was living proof of that. She looked out the window. The sky was clear, as if the day had been tailor-made for her. She grabbed her keys and left the house with a feeling of excitement. She drove to the luxury mall where one of Marco's jewelry chain stores was located. The idea of walking in there without anyone knowing who she was and choosing something for herself made her smile. There was a certain magic in being able to plan everything by herself. As she parked, Amara took a deep breath. She walked with firm steps down the mall corridor, feeling ready for what was to come. Her heart was beating with excitement. Today would be a special day. Today she would choose the piece that would represent a decade of love, and she couldn't wait to see Marco's reaction. She walked through the jewelry store's entrance with a soft smile on her face, not imagining what awaited her inside. As soon as Amara walked through the jewelry store's doors, she felt the mood change. The air, which had been light, seemed to grow denser as her eyes roamed the store's interior. It was a luxurious space with glass shelves filled with jewelry that sparkled under the careful lighting. The display cases shone like stars, displaying pieces that seemed inaccessible, almost untouchable. There were few customers, all of whom seemed at ease in this ostentatious setting. She was initially greeted with indifference. The first attendant she saw gave her a quick glance before turning to another employee. It was as if Amara's presence had gone unnoticed, as if she were invisible in that environment. However, this did not bother her immediately. Amara was used to this type of situation. Often in prestigious places, her appearance made people hesitate, but she had learned not to let it bother her. Amara calmly approached one of the display cases, admiring a diamond bracelet that immediately caught her eye. She imagined how perfect that piece would look on Marcos's arm, as a discreet and powerful symbol of the relationship they had built over the years. The shine of the bracelet reflected something deeper for her, the effort, mutual respect, and complicity they had. "Excuse me," Amara said politely to the nearest clerk, a stiff-faced young woman who seemed to be too busy organizing documents behind the counter. The clerk looked up, her cold gaze landing on Amara suspiciously. "Yes? How can I help?" she asked, her voice sounding disinterested, almost condescending. Amara smiled politely, ignoring the tone. "I'd like to see that diamond bracelet, please." The clerk hesitated, as if considering whether it was worth showing the jewel. Her eyes traveled over Amara's simple dress, her unbranded bag, and finally the calm, confident look on the customer's face. Instead of promptly fulfilling the request, she glanced at another employee, and the two exchanged a quick whisper, followed by muffled giggles. Without losing her composure, Amara waited patiently. She knew what was happening. This wasn't the first time she had experienced something like this, and it might not be the last. People still judged by what they saw on the surface. However, the discomfort inside her was beginning to grow. The employee's attitude was a constant reminder of how, despite all the success, prejudice and racism were still present. subtle but sharp. Finally, the waitress turned to the manager, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, and whispered something in his ear, pointing discreetly at Amara. He frowned, looked in her direction, and then his eyes narrowed. With firm steps, he approached, adjusting his tie as if preparing for a confrontation. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, unsmiling. "Can I help you with anything?" Amara, maintaining her usual calm, repeated her request. "I'd like to see that diamond bracelet in the display case, please." The manager stood still, his expression tense. "That's a very expensive piece. Perhaps something simpler would be more appropriate. Or would you prefer to come back another time?" he suggested, making it clear in his words that he doubted her ability to afford the piece. Amara felt her blood run cold, not because of the value of the piece, but because of what his words carried. The tension she had noticed in the air the moment she entered the store was about to turn into something much more painful. Amara's heart sank at the subtle yet cruel way the manager tried to push her away. The polite smile on her face began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. However, she didn't want to believe that the situation would get any worse. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding, a rash judgment that would soon be resolved. Still, the hurt began to grow in her chest. "I'd like to see the bracelet, please," he repeated, keeping his voice calm and steady, even though he knew the atmosphere had turned hostile. "I'm sure of what I'm looking for." The manager looked at her skeptically and glanced quickly at the other attendants, who were now watching her from a distance, laughing at something they were whispering among themselves. "Ma'am, perhaps something more affordable would be more appropriate. We don't want you to feel pressured into buying something that isn't within your reach." The words hit Amara like a slap in the face. Hearing muffled laughter in the background, her discomfort turned to humiliation. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure, but she felt the weight of suspicious and judgmental looks. It wasn't just the manager. Everyone seemed to have decided that she didn't belong there. Suddenly, a well-dressed, blonde customer walked into the store and was immediately greeted with smiles and compliments by the same employees who had ignored Amara. She didn't even have to ask. Within seconds, the attendant brought out a tray of diamond necklaces and earrings, with a completely different attitude. "This piece suits you perfectly," they said, almost in unison, as the customer was treated like royalty. Amara watched the scene in silence, her humiliation turning into deep pain. She knew it wasn't her clothes or her posture that made the difference in that place. It was her skin color. They had decided, without knowing her, that she couldn't be there, that she couldn't have the right to touch or buy the same items as the other customers. Trying to remain calm, Amara took a step back, considering leaving and simply letting it go. However, before she could make a decision, the manager, as if moved by some greater force, decided to deliver the final blow. "Look, ma'am," he said, his voice now firm and loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "If you're not going to buy anything, you'd better leave the premises. We don't want any trouble here. And to be honest, I don't know if you can afford any of these items." The humiliation was complete. The quiet laughter of the employees and the few customers around were now audible. Amara felt everyone's eyes on her. She felt like an intruder, someone who shouldn't be there. Her face burned with shame, but she refused to give in to that pain. Inside, a struggle was brewing. Part of her wanted to defend herself, to scream, to demand respect. But another part was exhausted from fighting against a prejudice that seemed to never end. She was about to turn around and leave when a new figure appeared at the entrance to the store, someone who would completely change the course of that afternoon. Amara was about to leave, fighting the urge to respond to the manager who had publicly humiliated her. Every cell in her body screamed to react, to defend herself, but she knew it would be no use. The words that had already been said carried a historical weight, an ingrained prejudice that, no matter how much she had faced it in so many other situations, always hit her with an indescribable force. However, before she could take the first step towards the exit, the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of a new customer. When Amara turned to look, her heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was Marcos, her husband. He was impeccably dressed in a well-cut suit, and his face carried the same air of confidence that always made her feel safe. His presence there, at that very moment, felt almost magical, as if somehow the universe had sensed what was happening and decided to intervene. Marcos entered the jewelry store with firm but calm steps, and as soon as his eyes landed on Amara, he smiled, that warm and protective smile that she knew so well. Amara tried to hide what she was feeling, but he soon noticed the tension in the air and the uncomfortable look she gave to the people around her. He knew his wife. He knew when something was wrong. "Amara, my love," he said, approaching her naturally, placing his hand on her shoulder with a protective lightness. "What's going on?" Before she could respond, the manager, who had been watching the scene with a mixture of confusion and discomfort, quickly approached. "Sir, may I help you? We're trying to resolve a situation here with this lady." Amara's discomfort in the coldness in the man's tone. "Situation? What are you talking about?" The manager, feeling pressured, maintained his condescending tone. "Well, this lady was insisting on seeing a very expensive piece, but she clearly doesn't seem interested in actually buying it. I think it would be best if she left to avoid any trouble." Marcos blinked slowly, as if absorbing the absurdity of what he had just heard. Amara watched silently, noticing the change in her husband's face. From calm to a mixture of indignation and frustration, he let out a deep sigh, but still maintained control. "So, let me get this straight," Marcos said, his tone calm but firm. "Are you implying that my wife, Amara, can't afford to buy something from this store?" The manager froze. "Wife?" He looked from Amara to Marcos as if trying to connect the pieces of the puzzle. "She is your wife?" Marcos stepped forward, his imposing posture causing the manager to flinch slightly. "Yes, she is my wife," he said, his voice now thick with authority. "And for your information, this jewelry store is part of our chain of stores. I am Marcos Andrade, the owner." The silence that followed was deafening. The employees' laughter immediately stopped, and the manager's face went pale as he processed the revelation. He tried to stammer out a response, but the words wouldn't come out. Everyone in the store, from customers to employees, stood there in disbelief. Amara, who had been the target of looks of contempt until then, now saw the same people looking at her with shock and embarrassment. The power of this revelation lay in its unexpected impact. No one imagined that the woman who had been treated with such disdain was, in fact, the wife of the owner of the jewelry store. Marcos looked around the store, his intense gaze making his displeasure clear. "I do not tolerate disrespect, and I definitely do not accept my wife, or anyone else, being treated this way in an establishment that bears my name." The silence in the store was almost palpable. Everyone was still, as if time had stopped after Marcos's revelation. The manager, visibly shaken, looked around as if expecting someone to come and save him from this untenable situation. The expression on his face oscillated between embarrassment and fear. He knew he had crossed a dangerous line. Amara, who had been quiet until then, watched everything with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because her husband was by her side, taking the lead in a situation that had become unbearable. But sadness because this was nothing new to her. Being underestimated, judged, and humiliated was something that happened all too often, and no matter how much she tried to ignore it, the emotional impact was always there. She wanted to confront the manager. She wanted to tell him how she felt, but she felt a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Marcos, however, was far from finished. His gaze, now fixed on the manager, reflected a silent fury. "Do you think you can judge someone just by their appearance?" he asked, his voice low but charged with authority. "Do you think that because she's black or because she's not dressed like the other customers, that gives you the right to treat her with less respect?" The manager stammered, trying to find an answer. "Sir, I didn't mean to offend anyone." "You didn't mean to?" Marcos repeated, taking a step closer. "You humiliated her in front of everyone. You laughed at her. You insinuated that she had no money. And you still think that's acceptable?" The waitresses who had previously laughed at Amara were now cowering in their seats, not knowing where to hide. One of them, visibly uncomfortable, took a few steps back, trying to get away from the growing tension. The customers who had witnessed everything continued to watch in silence, shocked by the unfolding situation. I apologize, sir," the manager murmured, his voice shaking. "It was a mistake. I didn't know she was your wife." Marcos shook his head slowly, frustration clear on his face. What if she wasn't my wife? If she was any other woman, would you still have acted the same way? That's what worries me. Prejudice doesn't just manifest itself when you know who the person is. The real problem is when you make assumptions without even caring to know the truth. The manager remained silent, unable to justify himself. He knew he had made a grave mistake, and nothing he could say now would be enough to make things right. Amara, watching the scene, finally decided to intervene. She didn't want the situation to be just about revenge or punishment. She wanted it to become a lesson, not just for this man, but for everyone present. Marcos, she said softly, placing her hand on her husband's arm. He looked at her, his eyes softening a little as they met hers. Amara then turned to the manager. What happened here today is not just a misunderstanding. This is something that many people like me face every day. You didn't know me, but you judged me by the color of my skin, by the way I was dressed. And that's what hurts the most. Not what you said, but what you believed before you even said it. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words as they came out. I'm not just asking for an apology. I want you to think about how you treat people. Not just the ones who might be important to you, but everyone. Because everyone deserves respect. Everyone has value. The manager, visibly remorseful, lowered his head. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I promise it won't happen again. Marcos looked at Amara, admiring her strength and calm in the face of such a painful situation. He knew how much it had hurt her, and the fact that she was handling the situation with such dignity filled him with pride. Let's go, love, he said softly, placing his hand on her back. Amara took one last look at the manager, who now seemed much smaller than when she had first entered the store. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step, a reminder that respect should be afforded to everyone, regardless of who they are or how they present themselves. The gentle breeze that blew across Amara's face as she and Marcos left the store felt like it carried with it a weight that had finally been lifted. Every step she took away from the jewelry store was a step away from the humiliation she had suffered, but also a step toward healing. The day that had started with so much anticipation and joy had turned into a harsh lesson in prejudice. But somehow Amara felt there was something to be learned, and perhaps even a reason to be grateful. Marcos, walking beside her, was still visibly uncomfortable. His silence reflected the way he internalized what had happened, even though he was there to support his wife. Amara knew that he wanted to solve everything for her. He wanted to protect her from any harm. And, at that moment, he protected her in the most visible way possible. But what Marcos didn't know was that Amara, from a very young age, had learned to defend herself from the internal and silent battles she faced daily. She had always been strong, even when the world tried to convince her otherwise. Are you okay? Marcos asked, breaking the silence as he looked at her face with concern. Amara smiled, a calm smile, but full of feeling. I'm better now. Thank you for being with me today. I know you were furious in there, but it was important that you were there. I needed you. Marcos frowned, his expression still full of frustration. I can't stand seeing you being treated like that, Amara. It's not fair. It never was. And I wish I could have done more, said more. Amara stopped and took his hand, looking into his eyes tenderly. What you did was enough. You gave me strength when I needed it. But this is a struggle I face every day. No matter how far I've come, how successful I am, the world still sometimes sees me as less than. And I can't control that. I can only control how I react. Marcos let out a deep sigh and ran his hand through his hair. I just wish you didn't have to go through this. It's exhausting. For you, for me, for all of us. Amara nodded, understanding his weariness, but also recognizing that this was the reality many people like her faced. Yes, it's tiring, but I also know that we can change the world, one step at a time. Today I was humiliated, but I also showed them that I am much more than appearances. I showed them that my dignity cannot be taken away. The two continued walking in silence for a while, feeling the peace of being together, but also the tension of knowing that this would not be the last time they would face prejudice. The city around them seemed to continue at its normal pace, indifferent to the pain they had just faced. However, in that moment, Amara felt strengthened, not only by Marcos's presence, but by the certainty that she would always be greater than any label or judgment imposed on her. As they walked down the sidewalk, Amara glanced at the jewelry store in the distance and allowed herself one last thought. We can't change what happened in there, but we can change the way it affects us. And maybe in the future, someone will think twice before judging a woman like me, before laughing at someone else. Maybe something will have changed. Marcos smiled, squeezing her hand affectionately. I believe that, and I believe in you. The two continued on their way, side by side, stronger together, more aware of the world around them, but also more determined to change it, no matter how small the step.